Hi, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you're watching this. We're going back into, for this recording, we're going to look at propositional logic. Hopefully that goes to full screen. Let's see, view, 100%, good. That is, we're going to be looking at chapter 6, point 1. This is going to be fairly straightforward. Hopefully you'll see parts of my screen. You'll see that I like sharp objects and other things that are on here. You learn what I've been watching recently. I guess Solo, a Star Wars thing is what I was watching the other evening. But 6.1 I think is fairly straightforward. What we're taking is everyday basic language and putting them into what we call symbols. Okay, let's do full screen. Okay, so this section introduces a new kind of logic called propositional logic. Now, in fact, it's not that new. For when you were doing diagrams, you were looking at propositions, and you were using Venn diagrams to look at categorical syllogisms and then ascertain their validity. Propositions. And when those propositions are put into an argument, which you're going to symbolize, you're going to, by the end of this chapter, be able to ascertain their validity. Again, the question is not about their soundness. That is comes after testing their validity. Okay? So we're going to be looking at these logical operators that are in your textbook as well. This tilde means not. So it's going to come before a P or Q or S or any sort of symbol. Now that letter is going to stand for an entire proposition. So you could say not T, where T could be you are a fool. So if you want to say you are not a fool, you'll say not T, right? This, right, is going to be the and symbol. This V, and you're going to have to memorize these. This V is going to be or, either or. This is going to be our conditional statement, if, then. And then this means, these three bars means if and only if. If you've taken this before, if you've done some symbolization in high school, and some algebra classes cover it, then you'll notice these might be slightly different from what you've looked at before. But these are the symbols that we're going to be using. So the tilde is not. It is not the case that. So it is not the case that, for example, if you want to say not P, it is not the case that John went to the movies yesterday, not J. Okay? It is sometimes called, of course, the negation sign. So it's used to negate any statement that follows it. For example, if the letter A represents Atlanta is beautiful, then not A means, of course, that Atlanta is not beautiful. Where this gets confusing is that you might have this as a proposition, and then somebody puts a not, and then all that means is Atlanta is not beautiful. And if, as you know from basic English, not means yes. So it would mean not Atlanta is beautiful. I actually don't think it is a very beautiful place, but that's up to there. The dot, that's up to you. The dot represents and, or also, or moreover. It is the conjunction sign. Okay? So you would use the dot to connect two different things. Atlanta is beautiful and Boston is interesting. That's where, so you would translate that by putting A and B. Atlanta is beautiful and Boston is interesting, again. The wedge, okay, that's the or unless. Sometimes you'll see that as unless. So just be careful if you see that on a quiz or exam or in the homework. If you see unless, it means the or, okay? It's disjunction, not conjunction. So where the and, the dot, is conjunction, this is disjunction, okay? So for A and B from before, either A, Atlanta is beautiful, or B, Boston is interesting. Okay? Okay? Or you could say Atlanta is beautiful unless Boston is interesting. Okay? But what this will mean is only either one is the case. Okay? So Atlanta is beautiful and Boston is interesting. Let's take this as practice, right? Okay. If A and B refer to earlier statements about Atlanta and Boston, how do you translate the statement Boston is not interesting and Atlanta is beautiful? Well, you don't put the tilde ever after the letter. So we get a not interesting, so it's not B, and we get an and. Atlanta is beautiful, right? So it would be this one, right? So not B and A. So how do we also translate Atlanta is beautiful or Atlanta is not interesting? Well, this is, as we know, we have no negation. There's no not, but we do get a not here. So we get an A, and then we get a not B with a wedge in the middle. Why the wedge? Because that's the or. Okay? Again, if you ever see the tilde after, you know that's not one of the answers. It's A or not B. That's how you translate that. A, wedge, tilde, B is A or not B. Okay? So how do you translate Atlanta is not beautiful? So we would know that this is already not A. And we're looking for the dot, dot, dot. So we've already excluded this one. Is not, and Boston is not interesting. So we get two nots, not A, dot, not B. Okay. Again, if you ever see this, you know it's wrong. The tilde always has to come in before the letter. So they actually made this process of elimination easy. It's an and, so it can't be the wedge. This tilde is in the wrong place, so that's wrong. And then you have that. Okay. But again, B or A can represent entire propositions. B could be not just Boston is beautiful, but B could be something that has nothing to do with the letter B. It could be B is the curtains in my room are maroon colored. Okay? So let's try another practice problem. Atlanta is beautiful unless Boston is interesting. Now we knew unless goes with what? Well, that doesn't mean and. This tilde is never an operator. And what I mean by an operator is it's not, I know that's confusing, but it's not connecting A and B. And tilde does not connect A and B together. It would be not B and then something connecting. And that's going to be and, or, if then, or if and only if. Okay? So, Atlanta is beautiful unless Boston is interesting. We don't have any knots, do we? No. And we know unless, we've already learned this, gives you the wedge. Again, you have to memorize those. You'll have to go back. Hopefully you've done the homework before you come to this lecture. Just go through that and you'll memorize it relatively quickly. This will be the easier part of Chapter 6. Atlanta is not beautiful. Okay, so we know it's going to be one of the knots. Okay, we have the not there. We have tilde meaning not, tilde meaning not. Also, Boston is interesting. And we learned already, also is and. So you can translate this differently. Atlanta is not beautiful and Boston is interesting. Okay, so Atlanta is not beautiful. I have to think that's true. By the way, it's very traffic filled and there's very nice some nice neighborhoods, but it's nothing like New Orleans and other beautiful cities throughout the South. Also, Boston is interesting. Okay, so we know it's and is the dot. Okay, in high school you may have gotten the sort of inverse wedge. It would be written like a upside down V. That's what you would have gotten in high school. But to make it less complicated, most logicians use the dot. Okay. Okay. I remember in my high school in algebra, that's what we used. So the horseshoe, sideways anyway, translates it if then, only if, or implies. So these both mean if then. Okay? So it's called the implication sign, but it's also the conditional. If then, okay? So we've already, or hypothetical. We've already seen this in hypothetical syllogisms. If A, then B. If B, then C. Therefore, if A, then C. Okay? From earlier on in chapter 1. We saw hypothetical syllogisms. With Venn diagrams, we saw categorical syllogisms. Okay? So this is the implication sign. If this, then it implies this. Okay? Implication. Atlanta is beautiful, then Boston is interesting. Now, of course, in the abstract, you wouldn't see an implication before them, but one could imagine if one finds Atlanta beautiful, then one might find Boston is beautiful. So A horseshoe B means if Atlanta is beautiful, then Boston is interesting. Or Atlanta is beautiful implies that Boston is interesting. Okay? So those are the different ways of translating A horseshoe B. Atlanta is beautiful only if Boston is interesting. Okay? Notice that the A comes before the B here. Only if Boston is interesting. The horseshoe is often used to translate of course, implies. We've gone through this quickly. Atlanta is being beautiful implies that Boston is interesting. Okay? So again, A horseshoe B could mean if Atlanta is beautiful, then Boston is interesting. It could mean Atlanta is beautiful only if Boston is interesting, or it could be Atlanta is beautiful implies that Boston is interesting. And your task in much of 6.1 is actually to work backwards from what we're doing here. In other words, you take a sentence like this and you translate it into symbols. Because that's what we're going to be working with. Right? So words such as given that, provided that, on the condition that are equivalent to if. And again, this is going to require a little bit more memorization. Okay? Given that, provided that, on the condition that Atlanta is beautiful, then Boston is interesting. Okay? The horseshoe can also be used to translate statements about sufficient and necessary conditions. We saw this in chapter 1, where we quickly went over this, right? Atlanta's being beautiful is a sufficient condition for Boston's being interesting. Okay? So sufficient conditions go into the antecedent, right? And it's a sufficient condition for B. Okay? Necessary conditions end up in the consequent. Okay? This would have been a lot easier to go over when we were doing chapter 1. Boston's being interesting is a necessary condition for Atlanta's being beautiful. So again, we reverse the sentence. Okay? Boston's being interesting is a necessary condition for Atlanta's being beautiful. It doesn't mean it's the only condition, but it's a necessary one. Okay? There might be other conditions for Atlanta being beautiful. Okay? You might not see any connection between those two. We're not worried about that at this point. Okay? So they give us here the mnemonic SUN to help us remember the relationship between sufficient and necessary conditions. And this is one of the few times where I find this actually helpful. The U is turned sideways. We have S horseshoe, or U, N. Sufficient conditions go on the left, and necessary conditions go on the right. Okay? So they're connected by this. So if S, then N. If S, sufficient condition, then N, necessary condition. Triple bar translate as if and only if. Okay? It's called the equivalence sign, which is what it looks like. It looks like an equal sign with an extra bar. Atlanta's beautiful if and only if Boston is interesting. So these both have to be the case. If Boston is not interesting, then Atlanta is not beautiful. But Atlanta is beautiful if and only if Boston is interesting. Okay? You should notice that A equals B is simply a shortened way of writing A implies B and B implies A. Right? If A, then B, and B, therefore A. Now notice this is going to require a little bit of memory back to and algebra that these parentheses separate out entire different aspects. So, okay, and we're going to need to work on that, because if we lost this parentheses, we would not have a well-formed full propositional statement. If A, if and only if B. The triple bar is often used to translate is equivalent to. Atlanta's being beautiful is equivalent to Boston's beautiful, but that's not the point, right? We're going to be testing for validity, and we're only looking at this point to symbolize them, okay? Whatever you think of the relationship between Atlanta and Boston. Beautiful is a sufficient and necessary condition for Boston being interesting. Okay, that's what the triple statement means, triple bar means, right? That is, Atlanta's being beautiful is a sufficient condition. You certainly need it, but it's also necessary. It's all you need. Okay. Okay. So now let's work this out. If Boston is interesting, how do you translate if Boston is interesting, then Atlanta is beautiful? Well, I hope this is clearer now that you would know that the if then is probably the more easy way to see that. So it's A, horseshoe, B. Or B, horseshoe A. Well, B is for Boston, right? Therefore, if B, then A is what we have here. Okay. So how do you translate Boston is interesting if and only if Atlanta is beautiful? Well, if and only if is the triple bar, right? If and only if. Boston is interesting if and only if Atlanta is beautiful. Hopefully this is clear. So how do we translate Boston is interesting only if Atlanta is beautiful? Well, we learned only if is the condition, is the sideways horseshoe, right? If Boston is interesting, then Atlanta is beautiful. Okay. Boston is interesting if Atlanta is beautiful. Now, here we see the if goes on this side. It's not only if. Don't let that confuse you. And I know the book is attempting to do that. It is just simply if. If Atlanta is beautiful, then Boston is interesting. So the antecedent, and that's terminology learned in Chapter 1, and I'm sorry to bring it back because I'm trying to get some of the verbiage as simplified as possible for you. But unfortunately, this is what we're left with, okay? If Atlanta is beautiful, then Boston is interesting. So it's if A, then B, right? The antecedent always follows. Antecedent means, remember, comes first, like A in the alphabet, right? Antecedent being A, consequent, C. A comes before C, antecedent comes before consequent. So if antecedent, then consequent. Boston is interesting. Boston being interesting implies that Atlanta is beautiful. Okay. Well, remember, implies that actually gives us the reverse, shouldn't it? Let's see. It means if Boston is interesting, then Atlanta is beautiful. If B, then A. Okay? So implies replaces a horseshoe. Boston's being interesting is a sufficient condition for Atlanta being beautiful. Now, we already learned that from the word sun, sufficient condition comes first, right? So the sufficient condition is Boston being interesting is a sufficient condition. So B, then A, okay? Okay, remember the mnemonic. A mnemonic, by the way, is just a memorization device. Sun, sufficient condition, horseshoe, necessary condition. But since this is a sufficient condition, it comes first. If B, then A. Okay. Boston being interesting is a necessary condition for Atlanta's being beautiful. Again, use the mnemonic sun, right? S, sideways U, N, sufficient condition, then horseshoe, the necessary condition. And so the necessary condition, Boston being interesting is a necessary condition, so it comes to the right. So it's if A, then B. I know this comes first but it's a necessary condition, so it goes there. If A, then B. Okay? So again, that might be difficult for you, right? So try to keep that in mind. It's the necessary condition, so we know that it goes to the right. Remember the mnemonic, sun, S-U-N, the horseshoe. So since B is a necessary condition, it comes second. So just because of its the way it falls within a sentence, doesn't mean when you symbolize it, it gets translated that way. I know that's one of the difficult parts of 6.1, is that it just doesn't follow necessarily the order in which the everyday sentence follows once you put it into symbols. So, Boston being interesting is a sufficient and necessary condition for Atlanta's being beautiful. We already learned quickly that this is the triple bar. When it's both a sufficient and necessary condition, then it's B, triple horseshoe, A. And by the way, it could be A, triple horseshoe, B. The order doesn't matter in this one. Okay. So an important rule, whenever more two letters occur in an expression, parentheses or brackets must be used. Parentheses and brackets indicate the range of the operators. That's not a good way to put it. What it means is you need to start to put other things, you have to put things in order. Okay? And we'll see what we mean by that. But if you have more than two letters, you're going to need parentheses or brackets. And it can get very complicated because brackets go within the parentheses. So A or B and C is ambiguous, just as 3 plus 4 times 5 is ambiguous. You will remember this from algebra, right? And I know that a lot of you taking the course were trying to avoid any math. Unfortunately, you just need to remember that rule, that we put things in parentheses so that we make it unambiguous. Right? 3 plus 4 times 5 could mean 7 times 5, which is 35. Or it could mean 3 plus, parentheses, 4 times 5, that is 3 plus 20, right, which is 23. So these are both here. Okay? So A or B in parentheses and C is not logically equivalent to A, wedge, or, parentheses, B and C. So just as in algebra, we have to be careful about where we put the parentheses and whether it translates well what is in a sentence. Okay? So commas, semicolons, either and both indicate where parentheses and brackets must be placed. Okay, and we'll see that better by example. So note the commas. Okay, A or B and C. So Atlanta is interesting, or beautiful, or Boston is interesting, comma, and by the way, Chicago is windy. Right, and so that's what this means. A, Atlanta is interesting, or Boston is interesting, parentheses, big comma, and it happens to be the case also that Chicago is windy. Here, Atlanta is interesting, comma, that is, or both of these are the case. Boston is interesting and Chicago is windy. So note the location of both. Atlanta is beautiful, or both Boston is interesting and Chicago is windy. And so this both, like the comma, tells us that is where another parenthesis begins. Both Atlanta is beautiful or Boston is interesting. So, okay. And Chicago is windy. So that both tells us take the first two, put them in the parentheses, and then use the dot for the and then Chicago is windy. When both appears at the beginning of a statement, it indicates the main operator is the dot. When it appears in the middle of a statement, it indicates what follows goes in the parentheses. So here we see Atlanta is beautiful, or both Boston is interesting and Chicago is windy. So notice that Atlanta is beautiful, or both, right? Both is the parentheses. Boston is interesting and Chicago is windy. But the both is here in this sentence, both Atlanta is beautiful or Boston is interesting, is one part, so therefore we put that in parentheses, and Chicago is windy. Okay? So notice here, when either appears at the beginning of a statement, it indicates that the main operator is a wedge. When it appears in the middle of a statement, it indicates that what follows must be put in parentheses. So, Atlanta is beautiful, and either Boston is interesting or Chicago is beautiful. That's the second case, right? So Atlanta is beautiful, and either B or C, right? And B or C have to be put in parentheses. But if either is at the beginning of a sentence, then it's either or, and that acts as your main operator. Okay? Atlanta is beautiful and Boston is interesting, right? Put in parentheses, or Chicago is windy. So both and either can be used in conditional statements, right? But this gets, I think, a little bit easier because you have the if and then helping to separate things out for you. Okay? If Atlanta is beautiful, A, then horseshoe, both, and now we have the parentheses, Boston is interesting and Chicago is windy. If Atlanta is beautiful, boom, then horseshoe, either Boston is interesting or Chicago is windy. And again, use parentheses for whatever comes after the then, and either there in the middle of a sentence means parentheses are in the second spot, and the or is our wedge, and the and is our dot. Some examples, okay? Another way of indicating the range of an operator is to combine two subjects with a single predicate. So, in other words, Atlanta is beautiful, or Boston and Chicago are cold. See how these are both combined, right? Boston and Chicago are cold. So what that tells us is it's either Atlanta is beautiful or Boston and Chicago are cold. And so you have to put those in parentheses. We're told these are both true about this. So if Atlanta is beautiful, then Boston and Chicago are cold. So notice how these are combined together. Okay? This is a lot of information coming at you very quickly, and that's why it's important to do a lot of practice, both with the extra assignments that they're not assigned, but the extra work on the website, but also by doing, obviously, the homework. So notice the proper placement parentheses when we have two horseshoes, and you're going to see these. Okay? If Atlanta is beautiful, then if Boston is interesting, then Chicago is windy. So notice we have a double if-then. If Boston is beautiful, then if, now we got to separate out again, Boston is interesting, then Chicago is windy. Now, this, of course, is a very windy sentence itself, actually, but you see the point there. You get if, then, okay, that's our main operator. If, then we're starting over again, and we put in parentheses. A, horseshoe, parentheses, B, horseshoe, C. If Atlanta is being beautiful implies that, so if, then, that Boston is interesting, comma, then C. A, horseshoe, B, in parentheses, that's this whole first part, is in parentheses, then Chicago is windy. Parentheses, this is where it gets difficult. Both parentheses and brackets may have to be used. Okay? So the brackets, unlike in English grammar, like when you're doing a quote within a quote, the brackets actually go outside the parentheses. Okay? So here, if Atlanta is interesting, or then either, so we're told that's the main operator, then either, so it's this either is, yes, officially in the beginning of the sentence, but we have if, we're told the main operator for the second part is going to hold together Boston is interesting, or both Chicago and Detroit are cold. So again, this is the more difficult part, but this will come up a lot later. You'll have plenty of practice with this, okay? Especially when we get to the truth tables, okay? If A, then this whole thing, either B is interesting, or, and remember this, when we have two things combined, it's in its own parentheses, C and D. Okay? Just as in algebra, you can have 2 plus 6 times, parentheses, 8 times 5, and parentheses, brackets. Okay? And where you put those brackets, then we'll change the whole mathematical meaning of the sentence. If Atlanta is beautiful, then if Boston is interesting, then Chicago and Detroit are cold. Okay? Then, brackets, Boston is interesting. If Boston is interesting, okay, so then the main operator is going to be there. Chicago and Detroit are cold. See how they're combined? Chicago and Detroit are both cold. So they go in their own parentheses, and then we work our way out. If then, parentheses here, brackets, because this is the whole second part, then you get an if then A, then bracket B, horseshoe, C, parentheses C, dot, D, parentheses, brackets. So, Atlanta is beautiful, Boston is interesting, C is windy. So Boston is interesting, comma, all right, and Atlanta is beautiful, or Chicago is windy. So this comma tells us this what follows the comma is the main operator. So Boston is interesting, we got B at the beginning, and Atlanta is beautiful, or Chicago is windy. So parentheses, and we have the or. Okay. Chicago is windy and Boston is interesting, comma. So now we know the main operator is going to be this or, because it follows the comma, right? So C and B is going to be in parentheses. Then we're going to have our main operator, or Atlanta is beautiful, right? Okay, so the location of the comma indicates the main operator is the wedge, the or. So the C and the B must go in parentheses. Boston is interesting, or both Atlanta is beautiful and Chicago is windy. Okay, so how do we do this when we don't have a comma, right? Well, we're given this both, right? And this both tells us these are both the case, or this is the case, right? So this guy, Boston is interesting, gets to sit out all alone, while these both go in parentheses. So Boston is interesting, or the wedge, both A and C. Right? This is, then that's what you have, right? So if B or both A and C. So how do we translate this? Either Boston is interesting and Chicago is windy, or Atlanta is beautiful. Well, we've already learned that the either at the beginning means that the or here is going to be our main operator. And what I mean by our main operator is it's the one not in parentheses. Okay? So Boston is interesting and Chicago is windy. The and is going to be a dot. So we now, by process of elimination, it's not this one. And it's going to be in parentheses, right? Because Boston is interesting and Chicago is windy, or, because that's the main operator, we are only left with this option. Parentheses B, dot C, and parentheses wedge A. Okay? So when we see the either, it tells us the main operator is the or. Chicago is windy and either Atlanta is beautiful or Boston is interesting. Again, if you get the either in the middle, like in this way, then that is going to be in parentheses. Either this is the case or this is the case. It's in parentheses, Chicago is windy. Okay. Oops, sorry, did I do that wrong? Let's see. Chicago is windy and either, right, this is the horseshoe, and either A or B. Okay, there we go. And let's do the correct one. Sorry, quickly clicking. Of course, we have no horseshoe because we don't have any if-then sentence statement. We don't have a conditional statement or a statement of implications, I call it. Chicago is windy, or Boston and Atlanta are historic. Now remember, when two things are put together, both of these are historic. This part of the statement means Boston is historic and Atlanta is historic, but of course, in everyday English, we would just say Boston and Atlanta are historic. We know that they belong in parentheses together. This or tells us then it's the main operator, and Chicago is windy. So we have this one. This one is not well formed. You cannot have C or B and A, right, without parentheses, because that's not well formed. And this is a possibility, but we don't have an if-then statement there at all. So even by process of elimination, you would get the first one. So if Boston is interesting, then if Chicago is windy, then Atlanta is beautiful. And so this one is a little bit more confusing because you're going to have two conditional statements. So we know the main one is we have this second if. So let's work it out. If Chicago is windy, then Atlanta is beautiful is going to be in its own parentheses. So it's going to be if C, then A. So we look for one where the second part has the C horseshoe A, which we do. And so the main operator is this then, because not least because it follows that comma. And so you have B horseshoe C, parentheses C horseshoe A. Okay. The first occurrence of the then indicates that C and A must go in parentheses. If Chicago's being interesting implies that Chicago is windy, comma, then Atlanta is beautiful. And remember, after the comma comes our main operator. So it means that we don't have another if here, if then. So if Boston's being interesting implies that Chicago is windy, then Atlanta is beautiful. So then we have these two are in parentheses, and then we have the main operator. If B, then C within parentheses, then A. Okay. So the single comma indicates that the main operator is the second horseshoe. So here we get the triple bar, finally. Chicago is windy. Oh, sorry. Only if, we don't have an if and only if, sorry, I was jumping ahead. Only if, right? And remember, that's the conditional statement, right? Chicago is windy. If Chicago is windy, then either Atlanta is beautiful or Boston is interesting. And so we know the either or here is in its own parentheses, right? So, Chicago is windy only if, horseshoe, A or B. The words only if can be replaced with the horseshoe, and the word either indicates that A and B, the B, must be put in parentheses, with, of course, the wedge in between them. Atlanta is beautiful, provided that Detroit and Chicago are cold. Now, we see this. Both Detroit and Chicago are cold. So by process of elimination, by the way, which is a good way to go about this as well, at least for test taking and for homework, but I'd rather you got it straight on your own. Chicago, D and C is going to be in your answer in parentheses, right? Okay. And so if A, provided that Detroit and Chicago are cold, right? Oh, sorry. This is the provided that means that they're reversed, right? So Atlanta is beautiful, provided that Detroit and Chicago are cold. And what that means is if Detroit and Chicago are cold, then Atlanta is beautiful, okay? And so it should be the other way around. Provided that means if. So luckily you didn't have to learn anything for the then, but you did have to learn for what replaces if. And so if the if comes second, then it must go first when you symbolize it. Okay? If Detroit and Chicago are cold, then Atlanta is beautiful. So now that we get the either at the beginning, right? Detroit and Chicago are cold. We get a big and here, though, and we know that these have to go in parentheses. Or Atlanta and Boston are historic. So we get another both, and we get them in parentheses. So either D and C, parentheses, or A and B. A and B, right? So we make sure that these are D and C, because we have an and, or both are the case, and Atlanta and Boston are historic, right? So we have both, and we get that, all right? But the either tells us that the wedge is your main operator. This is not well formed at all, right? Why? Because it doesn't tell us you can put these in different order, or you just as an algebra, and that will screw up your answer. So if Detroit is cold, then either Boston is interesting or both Atlanta is beautiful and Chicago is windy. All right, so if Detroit is cold, right, comma, then. All right, now it gets complicated, but we're given this comma here, which tells us this if then is our main operator. So after a D is going to come a conditional statement, or it implies that, which is the horseshoe. Then either Boston is interesting, or both Atlanta is beautiful and Chicago is windy. So both Atlanta and Chicago is beautiful. Atlanta is beautiful and Chicago is windy. We know those go in parentheses. So let's work backwards. A and C, either or. Okay, B or C. Okay, good. We know this is the main operator. So then we're going to have to put brackets around this. And then we get D, horseshoe, brackets, B, wedge, parentheses, A, dot, C, end of parentheses. Right? Let me make sure I got that. I don't want to click too quickly. But yes, that's it. The then indicates that everything to the right must go in brackets. Right? But it's really more important that where the comma is there, too. Another important use of brackets is to express the phraseology not both and not either. So here's an example. Not both Atlanta and northern cities. So another way of using the brackets is actually to getting this tilde, that these both are not the case. Okay. Not both Atlanta is beautiful and Boston are northern cities, which actually turns out to be true. Not both of them. Okay. Not either, of course, is going to give us a wedge, but they go in parentheses. Not both Atlanta and Boston are northern cities. Not both is not the same, both not. Okay? Both Atlanta and Boston are not northern cities. Right? That's what this is. Right? Not A and not B. Okay? Or not northern cities. Right? But not both and not either. See how that not goes before the both? Just stick with me here. I understand the difficulty. Not both A and B at the same time. That's really what it means. Whereas this means something different logically. Not A and not B. All right, so look for that not both when you want to look for parentheses. Okay? Not both Atlanta and Boston are northern cities. Right? So this just means not Atlanta and not B. Not A, not B. Combined by the main operator and. Okay? Again, this is confusing, I'm sure, but stick with me and just try to memorize this. The not both. Okay, so not A or B means not either Atlanta or Boston is a northern city. This is not equivalent. When we get to the truth tables, you'll see this more. Atlanta or Boston is not a northern city. So we put not A or not B, right? Because not A or not. So here again, just let's look at this again. The first statement is false because Boston is a northern city, but the second statement happens to be true because Atlanta. So again, they are not equivalent. Okay? So not either Atlanta or Boston is a northern city, right? Notice how this is false when we actually. An example to give you how this is not the same. Either Atlanta or Boston is not a northern city, right? Okay. Well, not either means neither. That, and then neither Atlanta nor Boston is a northern city. So when you see neither, to make things more complicated, it means not parentheses and neither are the same, are equivalent, but either or is not, is very different, right? And just think, okay? I told you that we weren't looking for soundness or the truth of the statements, but this shows you how they mean very different things. Or either Atlanta or Boston is not a northern city. And again, try to remember that not either, just as in English, everyday English, means neither. The relationship between these statements can be clarified by appealing to an important rule in logic. We call it logically equivalent to not P or not Q. We're going to use this for translation later on. Okay? Not P or Q is logically equivalent to not P and not Q. We're going to go over later in chapter 6 just how we demonstrate this logically. Okay? But for now, you'll just have to take it for granted. Not P and Q is logically equivalent to not P or not Q. Not P, parentheses, not P, parentheses, P or Q is logically equivalent to not P, both at the same time. Not P and not Q. Okay? De Morgan was a logician. Okay? So according to De Morgan's rule, when the negation sign is moved inside of parentheses, a dot changes to a wedge, and a wedge changes to a dot. Okay? So, in other words, when we move this inside, we put it on both of them, we change it to a wedge. When we move this inside and put it before the P and put it before the Q, we change the wedge to a dot. That's all that's going on there. It sounds more complicated, but basically, if we want to get rid of the parentheses, and there'll be reasons for doing so, as you'll see, then we have to change the operator. Okay. So not both Boston and Atlanta are northern city is translated not both, in parentheses A and B, and an alternate translation is not A or not B. Okay? But it's definitely not translated as this, not A and not B. And you saw already how it's not equivalent, but it will be equivalent to this. Right? So not A and B, so not Atlanta and Boston are beautiful, means either Atlanta is not beautiful or Boston is not beautiful. That's really what that means. But we can't translate it as not Atlanta is beautiful and not Boston is beautiful. You can see that this leaves open that Boston is beautiful or something. This does not. So here we continue again, looking at how to do basic translation work. It's not, I say basic, I get that it's not easy. So not both Detroit and Atlanta are southern cities. Right? So not both. Okay? Not both is where you go for your parentheses. Okay? Not both and are southern cities, right? The tilde goes outside the parentheses. Both Chicago and Boston are not southern cities. Both Chicago, so this both tells us it's before a parentheses, are not southern cities. Right? Which means, also to use De Morgan's rule, not Chicago or, sorry, Chicago is not a southern city, or Boston is not a southern city. Right? Which we know happens to be true. Right? Not C or B. Wait, sorry, so this is not both. Sorry, not both. This translation says not. Oh, sorry, my fault. I got that. I'm clicking OK. Right? This statement says that Chicago is not a southern city and Boston is not a southern city. So the not actually does not go outside the parentheses. So both are not the case, right? Because this is just one statement. Right? So not goes before C and not goes before B. I really should eat before I do these lectures. So I'm paying better, or at least have my coffee on hand. So not C and not B. Okay? Okay, that's the main operator. We're saying this about both things. So how do we translate neither or not either? Well, that one is not either Chicago or Boston is a southern city. All right? Well, we could think that the not either would be this, right? And that's correct, right? Not either Chicago or Boston is a southern city. So that the neither or not either means parentheses, okay? So either Boston or Atlanta is not a southern city. That's something different, right? Why? Because these two are combined. Boston or Atlanta is not a southern city. So this really means Boston is not a southern city, or Atlanta is not a southern city. So if you can do that kind of translation, you're going to get this, right? The statement to be translated says either Boston is not a southern city, or Atlanta is not a southern city. So, but how do we translate not either Boston nor Atlanta is a southern city? Well, we saw that not either or neither comes before a parentheses. Okay? So not either or neither gives us parentheses. You just need to remember that rule. Okay? So not either Boston or Atlanta is a southern city, so we know it's the wedge. Sorry. Neither Boston or Atlanta is a southern city. Okay, let's go. So according to De Morgan's rule, not B, not parentheses A and B, is logically equivalent to what? Well, we said move the tilde in, get rid of the parentheses, not A. We change this to a wedge, and we put the tilde against with this and get rid of the parentheses. So it's not the and because we have to change it. It's not the and because we have to change it. It's this, the wedge, not A or not B. Okay. So according to De Morgan's rule again, we're going to go move this inside. We're going to get rid of the parentheses. We change the wedge to an and we put the tilde before each of them. So which one does that? So we know we have an and. These are both wedges, so automatically this one is it. Okay. Not one and not the other. Okay. Well, it looks like we have finished for today. I hope that is as clear as possible, but if not, please, we could have virtual office hours to go over symbols and translations. This is going to be extremely important because from here on in, we're going to be working on translation work and symbols, okay, and working with symbols only. So it's really important that you're able to take everyday language and move them into symbols. But also really to remember what a tilde, dot, wedge, horseshoe, and triple bar means and why we use parentheses and brackets. Okay? The most difficult part here is the not, both, and neither, okay, which are six, were the 6 problems here. But in general, you'll do fine, okay? Not both and not either gives us the parentheses and so on, okay? And then we have De Morgan's rule, which we'll be looking at again, so it'll be reinforced later on in the chapter before you take any quiz or exam. All right, thank you very much, and have a great day. Again, you can always see me during my office hours, or we can set up virtual office hours via any way that gets video between you and me, or even a phone call. Okay, thank you very much.